Okay, this is the second video lecture on the empire that Augustus Caesar created. I want to start with this map, which gives us an indication of the growth of the Roman territory under Augustus. You can see that everything in yellow here was essentially Roman territory, had been incorporated into the Republic by 31 BCE, when the Battle of Actium was fought. Some of these places were client kingdoms, like Judea, for instance, was already kind of a client kingdom. Egypt was independent, but independent politically, but dependent on Rome in other ways, right? And same with some of the territory in North Africa here. But Augustus, over the course of his reign, mostly through diplomacy, occasionally through war, incorporated these other territories fully into the Roman Republic. Now, we've already mentioned that Egypt was kind of an exception to this, that Augustus administered this directly and did all of the tax collection, tax farming from that, and this is really the most important way that he was able to amass the largest personal fortune that perhaps the world has ever seen. And that personal fortune allowed him to do things that no other politician could do. And in the timocratic system that Rome had, this gave him just an insuperable advantage. We've already mentioned that his military achievements past the Battle of Actium were not very impressive, and in fact, there were a number of setbacks. But through diplomacy, he did manage to push Roman territory into the lands of the Germanic peoples, this territory that the Romans called Germania, and most of this was through, as you can see in the Italian here, it says Regni Clienti, meaning client kings of Rome. Okay, under Octavian is what that says. And so there were some Germanic leaders who sort of swore their not allegiance to Rome, but at least entered into a subordinate relationship with Rome, paid tribute to Rome. And so, Rome was big enough and scary enough and powerful enough that they did manage to subdue people in the borderlands, even if they didn't fully incorporate them as they would have wanted, right? The 3 legions that he sent east of the Rhine River were destroyed by the German forces, the Germanic forces, and Augustus was never really able to send legions back there, and in fact, that land remained outside of Roman territory ever after. So now, one of the things that starts to happen here is a sort of regular creation of provinces. Provinces that already existed, but it was rather haphazard. Augustus standardizes that to a great extent. And this is an important move in creating an empire that is administered more effectively. Now, under Augustus, and in fact under the entire Principate for the next couple of hundred years, in fact almost 300 years, the Roman provinces were always governed by either Roman patricians or part of the equites, which means a pool of about 1,000 men, and they're all men, so male figures, in Rome, and it never gets larger than that until Diocletian, who we'll talk about later in the semester, right? So this is not a large group that they're choosing from. This is, Rome did not have a huge civil administration. There's nothing approaching a modern bureaucratic state here necessarily, but they did work together with of course, the army, which did have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed in various provinces, mostly on the frontier, and soldiers were themselves they're not just, they were peacekeepers as much as they were, in fact, far more than they were like offensive figures, at least past Actium and past the military failures of Augustus's reign. Now, I want to take a look at some of the cultural products that help to mark the reign of Augustus. There are two of these that I want to look at specifically in this video lecture, and then I want to talk through some other points as well. The first of these is a piece of, well, it was an altar that was commissioned by the Senate to celebrate the peace that Augustus had brought to Rome. And specifically, this was commissioned in the year 13 BCE after Augustus had been sent on a peacekeeping mission, or a peacemaking mission, we might say, really kind of a military thing, to Iberia, where some of the native inhabitants of Iberia had risen up in rebellion against Rome, and Augustus led an army there and managed to subdue those people. And there was a big celebration when he came back, and they commissioned this piece of art, okay, which was a sacrificial altar dedicated to the peace, to keeping peace, or rather to the celebration of the kind of peace personified, we might say. And the Ara Pacis, which just means altar of peace in Latin, itself becomes an interesting statement of the kind of society and the kind of political system that Augustus was carefully trying to set up. And a big part of this is that Augustus, or our altar of peace, attempts to portray Augustus as a personality within the Republic, someone who was, holding the traditions of Rome very sacred and was trying to perpetuate them. But at the same time, this also demonstrates that although the veneer of the Republic was being kept in place, that Augustus was changing a great deal, that his family was emerging as by far the most important figures in Rome, and that Rome would never be the same politically after him. Okay. And so there are a number of scenes represented on the altar of peace. There is, for instance, a representation of either Rome or Tellus, which is the earth goddess. It's uncertain, and scholars kind of debate back and forth what these things mean because there is no specific explanation. Okay. In addition to that, in this scene, for instance, there's a figure making a sacrifice, and given that this is a sacrificial altar, that makes sense. The figure here has been debated. This was often explained as Aeneas, right? The figure in Virgil's Aeneid, and the kind of legendary Trojan warrior who came to Italy, and from his line came Romulus and Remus and the Roman people. But others have identified this as one of the early Roman kings with whom was the notion of peace was identified, Numa Pompilius specifically. And so, that is indicative of the theme of the altar, which is peace. Most interestingly for our purposes is this thing on the frieze, and it runs on both sides of the altar, this one and the opposite side. This is a procession of people, and in fact this is the background of all of these slides in this PowerPoint. This is a procession of people heading, it seems, to the altar of peace itself to offer a sacrifice as an expression of peace. But we can identify specific figures, including many of the family members of Augustus themselves, right? And so this figure, for instance, is almost certainly Agrippa, right, who was Augustus's right-hand man, and his son-in-law. And there is a young boy standing next to him, kind of tugging on his toga here. Agrippa is veiled, which means he is dressed in religious garb here, preparing for the religious ritual about to happen. The boy is probably his son Gaius, who had already at this point, he was like 7 years old in 13 BCE when this was commissioned. He had already been adopted by Augustus and was sort of being set up as his heir apparent. And we'll talk about Gaius and Lucius, his younger brother, later. Next to him is a figure who has inspired some amount of debate. This is probably Julia, who is Augustus's daughter and his only child who lived into adulthood, the mother of Gaius and Lucius, and at this point the wife of Agrippa. After Agrippa dies, and I think it's only a year or so after the altar was built that Agrippa died, Julia would later be married to Tiberius, who was Augustus's wife Livia's son from her first marriage, and Julia, is a kind of figure of some tragedy, we might say, and we'll talk about her later. This could be Livia, Augustus's wife herself, but that doesn't kind of make sense that she would be standing next to Agrippa. Livia's probably in here, but maybe part of the damaged figures. We can also see, and so if you look at the background here, you can see these people with these kind of funny hats. This is a part of the uniform of one of the colleges of priests, and so there were several groups, there were several priesthoods in Rome to different gods and different causes and things like that, right? And so this is one of these groups of priests, and so again, this is a religious procession. You can also see right in front of Agrippa, these are the lictors. They carry the fasces, these symbols of authority, right? Augustus, the figure of Augustus, if I go back a couple of slides, is in this damaged part. We can see part of his hairdo, and that's how they can identify this as Augustus, because Augustus is always portrayed with a certain type of hair. You can see that in the Augustus Prima Porte. This was his hairdo, and that's how he's always shown iconographically. Sorry, let me get through all of this stuff I already talked about. And so that shows up here, and so it's almost certainly Augustus, but the rest of his figure is damaged, but he also seems to be dressed in religious garb and headed for this, sacrificial ritual. There's some other children here. This may be Lucius, who was younger, and some have suggested then that this is Julia, his mother, but this could also be Octavia, Augustus's sister, and this may not be Lucius, it may be somebody else. There are even in this procession people who were dressed in non-Roman clothing and seem to be either guests or hostages sent from or captured from Germanic peoples. And that choice seems to be purposeful to indicate that everyone comes to Rome, that Rome is dominant over all peoples, that Rome has brought peace not only to the city of Rome itself, but to the whole world. Okay. And so there's a lot of family motifs in all of this, right? That's important. That Augustus and his family are shown here as participants in and leaders of this procession. The implicit message is he is the one responsible for bringing peace. He is the one who makes it possible for us to make this sacrifice to peace. And his family is the most important, but at the same time, they are not dressed differently than anyone else, right? They're dressed in the same religious clothing as other people. Agrippa is in this kind of veiled costume here, so is Julia. And so, they don't stand out from this, right? They are part of the long-standing traditions. Now, recall that Augustus did emphasize families, kind of family values, right? He was trying to encourage people to have lots of children, and, he was worried about promiscuity and things like that, and made that a public part of his we might say his political platform, though that's an anachronistic label there, but you get what I'm saying, I think, right? And his family then leads in that effort. Of course, his daughter Julia would cause some scandals, leading Augustus to exile her later in life. But in this instance, at least, Augustus is setting the example. He and his family are setting an example for everybody else. They are leading, yet they are also part of the Republic. The Republic is still in place. Augustus has just made it better and thus received honors that no one else has had. And so through this very carefully orchestrated set of measures that are represented in some ways in the altar of peace, right? Augustus changes the way Rome works. And a good deal of his success can be owed to the longevity of his rule. Augustus lived 45 years past the Battle of Actium until he was 76 years old. Now, for modern standards, that doesn't maybe seem to be very old. You may have grandparents or something who are older than that. But for ancient Rome, that's a remarkably long life, and especially to be in power that long, right? I mean, in a sense, he was in power from the time he was 18 years old when Julius Caesar died until he was 76. So we're talking, almost 60 years there where he's a key public figure. And people simply became accustomed to the way that Augustus was doing things. And that's an important element of this, right? Had Augustus died only a couple of years into this transformation, there might have been strong calls to go back to the old ways of the Republic. But over his very long life, people became accustomed to the new order of things and to this one person being in charge of so much. And because he brought peace and prosperity to Rome, or at least that was attributed to him, he took a lot of credit for it, right? And we'll look at him taking credit for that in the Deeds of Divine Augustus here in a second. People said, well, we need to continue with this system so that when Augustus died, in fact, even before he died, he was preparing the way for, a successor to fill the position he was in. And so what is the emperor exactly is a question that we might ask, right? If Augustus was very careful to say that all of this was, in keeping with Republican traditions, this was not an overthrow of the Republic at all, right? What did being emperor mean in the case of Augustus and even his early successors? Later on, we're going to see, emperors just flouting their power, and there's no question that they are the emperor and they're even deified and all of that. But Augustus himself, okay, he was, the emperor is in a way the sum of a number of parts. He was the princeps, right? He was the princeps senatus. The princeps was often the title that he went by. We already talked about the princeps senatus meant that he was the one who stood at the head of the Senate and spoke first and set the agenda for the Senate and all of that. But in addition to that, we've already said that, Augustus, when he laid down the consulship, which he did take a couple of other times later in his life, mostly to introduce his grandsons into public life by getting elected, by arranging to be elected as consul alongside them. And, there was no question of anybody challenging him in that. But he laid down the position of consul and in return received perpetual tribunician authority. So he was a tribune for life. And recall that tribunes had imperium. They could issue executive orders that had the force of law. And so he didn't need to be consul, he was tribune. He could make laws by decree. In addition to that, he was the Pontifex Maximus, which meant he was the head of the Roman religion, at least after Lepidus died, I think in 12 BCE. Augustus became the Pontifex Maximus, and after that, all the emperors served in that vital religious role, right, which went back to the earliest days of the Republic. And so he's a religious figure in addition to that. In addition to the political clout that he has, right? And he, of course, as we've said, had leadership over most of the army. And so there's a constellation of different positions having different authorities that amount to nearly supreme authority. So what happens to the other institutions of the Roman Republic then with this one person holding so much power? Well, the Senate the Senate continues to exist, but it becomes, at least under Augustus, just a rubber stamp, right? Augustus gives them busy work. He sets the agenda for the Senate to debate, right? So he's able to influence everything they're talking about. They can't do anything without him. And so whatever Augustus wanted to do, pretty much the Senate backed it. The assemblies are gradually phased out. In some cases, they continue to have ceremonial authority. They would continue to elect various minor officials. There were even consuls who were still elected, but the consuls, the power of the consul was diminished significantly by the end of the reign of Augustus. And And some of the assemblies, by the mid to late first century are just defunct and aren't even meeting anymore. The people, meaning the plebeians, 90+% of the population, did not have a voice anymore politically, meaning the concilium plebis, which had been a very important thing in the late Republic, was phased out and done away with, and given, for the while it continued to exist, it had mostly just ceremonial function. Instead, the people could demonstrate, they could give petitions. These petitions happened in things like the Circus Maximus, where when the emperor attended chariot races, or he staged, public entertainment events or something like that, the people would demonstrate, they would put up petitions, they would shout at the imperial box, and this is the way they got their voices heard. And in some cases, Augustus would listen to them, right? But the power of the people to influence law was diminished considerably under the Augustan peace. Augustus also, in a way to as a hedge against senatorial authority, created this thing called the Imperial Council. And this is kind of like a cabinet, as it were, in sort of modern political parlance. But an advisory commission to him directly. And this was made up mostly of equites, right, instead of patricians, instead of senators. And so the people who were just underneath, socially speaking, kind of in a class system in Rome, Augustus gave them this power and brought them into his chamber directly as advisors. He also created this thing called the Praetorian Guard, which may have existed in some way before this, but actually it had existed. There were the praetors had bodyguards, but this is taken over by Augustus and becomes a kind of imperial bodyguard. And it's the way that Augustus set this up, he increased the size of it tremendously. And he sets it up as a peacekeeping force in the city of Rome itself, in addition to protecting the person of the emperor. Now, the Praetorian Guard at this point is subservient to Augustus, but later the Praetorian Guard is going to become very, very important in influencing a number of things, including at times assassinating emperors and getting their favorites appointed as emperor and things like that. But under Augustus, they are subservient. We've already talked about the army under the direct control of the emperor, his control of the finances, right? Client kingdoms and provinces. This is another way that the emperor is able to bolster his position, that the client kings swear allegiance to him, or enter into a relationship with him directly rather than with the Roman Republic. And so he becomes the diplomatic face and really the diplomatic persona for all of Rome. Okay, so hopefully you can see how the position of emperor starts to work in this period. Now, the last thing I want to do is take a look at this document, the Deeds of the Deified Augustus, which you need to write a paper on. This is a really interesting piece of propaganda. This was written right before Augustus died. He himself seems to have overseen its writing, contributed to it, possibly dictated it. But this is a list of his accomplishments. And we can see here that he is still trying, even after 45 years of rule, to present himself and the system he has created as authentically Republican, as in keeping with all of the traditions. He is trying to downplay the amount of power he has. But at the same time, he is, making no mistake about what he has done for Rome and the importance he has, right? So he sort of finds a balance here between those two things. Every word, every sentence in this document is pregnant with meaning, and I'm not going to go through absolutely everything here, but it is, I think, worthwhile to look closely at this, to really read this closely, to parse out what these words and phrases mean, right? In light of everything we have said, there's so much scope for interpretation here. This document, and this was inscribed and put up on monuments, on stelae, right? Stone kind of inscription monument things. On roads leading into and out of Rome, the Appian Way, and these other major thoroughfares, the Via Sacra, All of those versions of this actually were destroyed. The sole surviving version came from Asia Minor, actually, I believe, what is now Turkey. But it was this document appeared all over the territory that Rome controlled. And so this was, a very public thing. This was not something that was kept in an archive or something like that. This is the way, obviously, that Augustus wanted his rule to be remembered. He begins by saying, at the age of 19 years, on my own responsibility and at my own expense, I raised an army with which I liberated the Republic from domination by a faction. Now, you could not be more vague than saying that, the thing that's underlined here. I liberated the Republic from domination by a faction. He says nothing about what was actually going on at that time, who the faction was. The faction was actually Marcus Antonius, and who later became his partner. He doesn't say anything about that. His partner in the triumvirate, but then his enemy after that, right? He doesn't want people to remember the strife that existed. All he wants people to know is that he liberated the Republic. And the Republic is the key word here, right? He is a champion of the Republic. That's how he tries to present himself. He says things a lot, like here in section 2, in the legally constituted courts, I took vengeance upon the murderers of my father by driving them to exile, and afterwards, when they waged war upon the Republic, I twice defeated them in battle. There is so much that is not said here, okay? But this phrase, in the legally constituted courts, he's not saying, I went and sought revenge for myself. He's like, I just did this legally, right? Everything that I did it by the will of the Republic, the will of the people. I didn't do anything of my own agenda. I was just a loyal servant of the Republic. I mean, you could not shovel the BS thicker than this, right, into a document, okay? But that's how he wants to be remembered. This is the propaganda aspect. He talks about, preferring to preserve rather than destroy the foreign nations which could safely be treated with clemency. And he especially mentions the settling of soldiers, many of whom, about half of whom, were in the employ of his enemies, or at least Marcus Antonius, right? That he settled them on land and gave them money and, really solved the issue that had bedeviled the late Republic of what to do with military veterans. He fixed that, right, is really the message there. Section 4 is important. He says, they tried to give me all of these honors, and I accepted some of them. I received more triumphs than any person in Roman history, but then they tried many more times to give me triumphs, and I refused them all. Why would he refuse them, and why would he point that out here? Well, I think, again, he's trying to say, I didn't do anything that wasn't in keeping with the traditions of the Republic. No one had received that many triumphs, and I didn't want to cheapen this institution of triumph, so therefore I said, no, I'm not going to do that, right? I did not accept the position of dictator. Important thing to point out, because, of course, Julius Caesar had accepted the perpetual dictatorship, almost, and Augustus never did. He was very careful not to step into that position, right? He wanted to show himself as non-threatening to the integrity of the Republic, okay? But he did things like a dictator did, like he solved problems, he says. There was a food shortage in the year 22, and I freed the entire state from fear and danger on my own expense, he says, and by my own efficiency. And then here he says, I laid down the office of consulship, and it was through tribunician power, meaning the office of tribune, that I completed those tasks which the Senate then wished to be performed. Not that I wanted to do, not that I thought needed to be done, but the Senate wished to be performed. And 5 times I asked for and received from the Senate a colleague in that power, meaning I wasn't the only tribune, I wasn't the only one doing this, but those colleagues, of course, would have been people who were just yes men to him, right? Very carefully crafted document. Right. Again, every word, every phrase here is so carefully chosen. There's a lot more. The honors that he received. Oh, this is where he mentions the altar of the Augustan peace. That's the Arapacis that we looked at, right? The Senate decreed that should be erected. And this was all about peace that he brought to Rome, and he's taking credit for that. He gave people money. He wants them to remember that, right? Many times. 300 sesterces on one occasion, 400 sesterces, 400 sesterces, 12 distributions of grain, 400 sesterces, 60 denarii, 100 sesterces, right? He keeps giving people money out of his own personal fortune. I mean, who wouldn't love a politician who just opened his wallet and said, here, for everyone who I'm governing, I'm going to give you $50,000. Which is, that's like the sums that he's talking about here, all right? I think that politician would be pretty popular, and he would want to be remembered for that. He talks about all of his construction projects. He really changes the face of Rome. I visited Rome recently and sort of, got a sense of how much Augustus transformed this, looked at the Forum, for instance, which is this kind of main square between all of the major hills of Rome. And Augustus either built or finished several buildings there, right? Or enlarged them, or improved them if they had burned down or whatever. Okay, and so he talks through all of these different things. He wanted them to, of course, to remember the public entertainments that he gave, gladiatorial shows he mentioned, fights of African beasts. 3,500 animals were killed in these fights. It's really terrible to think about, the loss of all of those animal lives, and the tremendous expense it must have been to bring African beasts to Rome, keep them alive long enough to then slaughter them in the arena. And he's doing this all with his own money, right? It's sort of staggering to consider. This, of course, before the building of the Colosseum. He's just finding places to stage these things. He even, staged a naval battle where 3,000 men fought in, a man-made lake in boats that they had built. And there were 30 ships on that. And this was all for the entertainment of the people of Rome. So we wanted them to remember that too. He says a lot of things that are misleading here. We've already said that, but one of the biggest lies and the biggest Pinocchios here is, I added Egypt to the empire of the Roman people. He didn't really. He kept that for his own personal possession. I mean, technically, I guess it became part of Rome, but he's the one who administered it directly. And people from all over the world look to him for guidance and counsel. He says the Parthians and the Medes asked me for kings. In other words, they asked me to kind of interfere in their political process and choose who got to be their king. And so everyone, Augustus gives the sense that the world is all Rome's and that he is at the center of all of this, while at the same time he is transferring the republic. He's transferring his power to the republic, right? Everything he does is at the will of the republic, not his own will, and thus he's the father of my country. So Augustus was a polarizing, a complicated figure, but we can see the definite method in his madness. And I think it could be safely said that the empire reached a kind of zenith, a kind of height under Augustus. There would never be an emperor quite this effective at all of these things again. It's the one who created all of it in the first place. All right, I'm going to stop there, and we will go on and look at some of what happens after the life of Augustus in the next video. Thanks.